parasite, an organism that lives on or in another organism to its own benefit, usually to the detriment of the host. This is a very common evolutionary strategy, very successful, and brain and body manipulation is a very common aspect of it. You may even be familiar with some examples. So Toxoplasmosa gondii, is it advancing?
I think it's, no, it doesn't.
You get next to
Way to steal time.
Toxoplasmosa gondii is a parasite you may be familiar with. It infects mammals. In particular, it has been shown to decrease the fear that rats show to cat urine. And cordyceps is a fungus that you may have heard of, the zombie ant from Planet Earth, etc. But let's look at some different examples that you may not be familiar with. This is an ant nematode. It infects this normally black ant, and as you can see, it turns the abdomen red, and it makes it hold its abdomen up in the air like this to attract the attention of birds. The next phase of the nematode's life cycle is in a bird, and so it wants this ant to get eaten by that bird. This is a ladybird parasite. It's a wasp that lays a single egg inside of this beetle, and the larva grows to almost the size of the beetle itself, emerges here. The beetle survives this process, but the larva has injected a virus into this beetle that will control it in the next phase here, where the larva spins cocoon, and the beetle is forced to watch guard over it and thrash around and scare away any predators that come by. But up to 25% of the beetles actually survive this process, which is amazing. This is a castrator barnacle, obviously hosts in a crab here. This is normally where you'd see the egg sac of a crab, but that is actually the barnacle's egg sac, and it's suffused throughout inside the body of the crab here. If it infects a female crab, then it just makes it take care of its young, but if it infects a male crab, it actually castrates the crab and forces it to take on female body characteristics and to actually care for the young and help distribute the young in the water when the barnacle's young are ready to distribute. But it gets even weirder than that. This is Liriopsis, which is the predator, the parasite of the barnacle itself. So the castrated barnacle actually has a parasite that castrates it in a twist of irony here. And a parasite of a parasite is called a hyperparasite, which I think is amazing. This is one of my favorite. This is a Massospora fungus. It infects cicadas. It's a fungus. The last third here is actually the fruiting body of the fungus here. But the cicada is still alive, as you'll see in a moment, which is completely crazy. What happens is that this fungus injects the cicada with a mixture of psilocybin and a form of amphetamine, keeps the cicada alive, and then turns it into this crazy kind of mating frenzy. It'll fly around all over the place trying to mate with things, but the rear third of its body is gone, and so it doesn't have any genitalia. It just keeps trying to mate with things, basically spreading spores all over the place. And the fungus, of course, is thrilled with this. Hence the nickname Flying Salt Shaker of Death. Oh, some extra time on that one. The green-banded broodstock, this is one of the weirdest ones, the creepiest ones to me. This large green section that you see here is the broodstock itself. It's grown from a very small organism into this large organism. It's about to emerge from the snail. So it crawls up into the snail's eye stalks there and encourages the snail, or manipulates the snail to go into a brighter, more exposed environment so that it can get eaten by a bird, which is the next phase of the life cycle for the green-banded broodstock. But it gets worse still for this poor snail. Well, it can get worse at least, because they can survive the attack, and snails have the ability to regrow their eye stalks. So it can regrow the eye stalk, it might still have some more brood sacs in it, and it can be parasitized repeatedly, which certainly would be no fun for the poor snail. And I think finally we come to, this is probably my personal favorite, the gall wasp. We actually have these around all over the place, and you can have multiple galls on one particular plant, each induced by a different wasp. So what happens is the wasp chemically induces these crazy growths from plants. They can be all sorts of different things. They can be very beautiful, and they are homes for the wasp larvae, homes and food. So the wasp larvae grows in there, it eats the material, and then emerges when it's ready. And they just take all these amazing forms. So I also wanted to just end by talking about some commonalities of these kinds of parasites. They have very complex life cycles, sometimes with multiple hosts, 2, 3, 4, 5. They induce behavior in their hosts to seek high up and well-exposed areas. And when feeding, they often avoid the vital internal organs to keep their hosts alive, which is incredible. They increase risky behavior, reducing fear response, of course, sometimes inducing these crazy movements to attract or deter attention. And as I mentioned earlier, the hosts can sometimes survive this process, not always to their benefit. So I just think that there's so much to learn about organisms through seeing what these parasites can do to them. The manipulation of their brain function, like induced by hormone changes and all kinds of other things. It tells us about how we work and how other organisms work. So these are just a very few examples. There are hundreds of examples of these. These are the ones that stood out to me and were unique that I thought a lot of people might not have seen. But it's a whole world, so if you're fascinated by this, like I am, dive into it. I'm happy to share more info and links and everything like that. Wow.
So now we can take questions, unless you would like to do something else with your time.
No, questions are great.
Okay, I'll start time.
That was disgusting.
Thank you. Yes.
You talked a lot about, you mentioned Toxoplasmodium gondii right up front, which
Yeah.
is one of the ones we know that affects humans.
No,
Potentially as collateral damage, but can you talk a little bit more either about that one or about something that might show up in humans?
Yes. Well, so I'll talk a little bit about Toxoplasmosis gondii, and then also maybe about sleeping sickness a little bit, which I didn't get a chance to get to. So toxo, as I said, it affects rats, and so they lose their fear of cat urine, and so I think the theory is that it's working on dopamine. It's basically shifting the amount of dopamine in the rat, and so it may be having similar effects in us. There's theorizing that it has potential association with schizophrenia and numerous other mental diseases, but it's all theoretical at this point. It's all kind of like we don't have causation, we have correlation kind of thing. But one thing that I did read in researching this, what I thought was fascinating, was that you can be infected, like up to 30% of people are infected with Toxoplasmosis gondii from cat feces and stuff like that. And it's non-symptomatic, basically, for the most part. But it doesn't mean that you're not infected. What happens is that the parasite can control your immune response. And so it sort of works this delicate balance of like, too much of an immune response and it will be ejected as a parasite, and too little of a response and its host will die. And so it actually has to control the immune system itself by manipulating these proteins. So, next. Sleeping sickness. Sorry. Oh yeah, sleeping sickness. So yeah, sleeping sickness, the tsetse fly. There are actually two different types of sleeping sickness. One in North America and one in Africa. The African one is the most familiar with. And it starts out in the body. It doesn't really have like a major effect when it's there, but then it crosses the blood-brain barrier, gets into the brain, and starts targeting all of these brain regions, and you start having all kinds of weird symptoms. Your speech starts getting affected. Your circadian rhythm gets thrown off through these hormone changes and whatnot. And eventually, degeneratively, it sort of looks like depression, so people don't really notice it a lot of the time. And then eventually, you basically just become, sleeping zombie.
And are either of these behaviors of benefit to toxo or to tsetse?
Oh, good question. Toxo is it infects a wide variety of mammals, but it mainly wants to be in the cat. That's where it can reproduce, and that's common to a lot of these parasites, is that they have to be in a particular organism to reproduce, so that's why they have sometimes these complex multi-chained life cycles. They get into a snail, and they get into a bird, and then they get into maybe something else, a fish, let's say, and that's where they can reproduce. Maybe they need to reproduce only in water. The horseshoe worm here has to get into water, and so it starts out in the cricket and induces the cricket to jump in. Anyway, so my point is that it's probably not a specific adaptive strategy of toxo in humans to do that. It's probably just a byproduct of the fact that mammals have a similar structure and similar brain chemicals, and so it gets in there. It's like, I can survive here, I'll just do the same thing I would normally do, but I can't breathe, kind of thing.
Awesome. Cool.
Yes? Ooh.
Do any of the animals, as you said, they're fairly specific, these parasites are fairly specific.
Generally, yeah.
Do any of these animals have any kind of targeted defense against these parasites, or are they just completely open to
That's a
them?
good question. I did read about a few sort of like almost a war between where one builds a defense and one overcomes it. I don't remember the specifics of that because I didn't end up including it in this. But there are definitely those kinds of things that happen. I would say though normally a lot of times the parasites don't have such a hugely detrimental impact on the organism's actual ability to reproduce and have a healthy ecosystem, that there isn't a lot of kind of back and forth like that, and a lot of opposing strategies, which I found interesting. So, yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
I don't know if there's behavior mod involved, but there was some naturalist I read found
5-link chain of wasps parasitizing wasps.
Yes. Yes.
And then of course the guinea worm, which makes us stick body parts in water so it can lay eggs.
Right. Yes. I'm glad you bring up the wasp thing. I didn't have time to talk about it actually here, but so I did mention hyperparasites. The gall wasps actually have wasp parasites of their own, and they do a very interesting behavior. So the gall wasp itself will, create the gall and lay its eggs inside of that gall. It develops. The wasp the wasp larvae kind of develop in there, but a hyperparasite comes along, another wasp, and injects its own eggs into that gall. They develop and they get into the wasp larva of the gall wasp, right? Then they induce it in some way that we don't fully understand yet to crawl most of the way out of the gall 2 weeks early before it would normally come out. It comes out, but just to the point where its head is exposed, and then it stops. And the hyperparasite is inside of that wasp larvae. It develops, and then it bursts through the head that is sticking out to the outside world of that wasp, now dead, of course. And the theory is that it does this because the hyperparasite, the smaller wasp, doesn't have enough jaw strength to chew out of this gall, so it makes the other wasp do it for it. Crazy. Other questions? Yes.
I'm a little afraid to ask this, but what's the most striking or horrifying or something parasite that does stuff to humans that you
Does stuff to humans. Well, fortunately, the tsetse fly is a pretty bad one. The sleeping sickness is a pretty bad effect. Rabies is one that affects us and is a pretty horrible and hard to catch. And
That's a parasite?
can be fatal. Yeah.
How about the alien in that first Alien movie?
Well, yes.
That was kind of gross.
That was really bad. This is essentially that. This is a screenshot from a video that I felt was too gruesome to put in this presentation.
Aww.
This creature, whatever this is, I think it's a fly or something, and then there's a wasp coming out of it. The fly is still alive, and the wasp is almost the size of the fly. I don't even know how it's still alive. As I was saying, a lot of these creatures, they'll survive it somehow. There's a caterpillar that has literally 50 or 100 wasp larvae that hatch out, and you see them come out of its body, and it survives, and then it guards the thing. Anyway, but human-wise, yeah, fortunately, there aren't a lot of these horrible things that happen to us. We do get a lot of smaller parasites and organisms that get into us and have sort of either dormant or somewhat unknown effects, like Toxoplasmosis gondii, what we were talking about earlier. We're not sure what it's doing. It's in 30% roughly of people supposedly, and cat owners in particular and all that, but we don't know what it does. It might be correlated with schizophrenia, it might be this, that, and the other thing. There's lots of other things too. I mean, there's gross things. The subject of this was particularly brain and body manipulation, but there's the cattle worm that can get into your eye. There's a video of somebody taking a worm out of their eye. There's all kinds of horrible things. There's flies that lay their eggs under your skin and they gestate, and then you have flies basically popping out of your skin. But again, I'm not so much focused on what's the grossest thing as what changes, manipulates the body, which fascinates me. These hormonal changes and these actual body structure modification, and then the brain manipulation, changing
That's
behavior.
okay. I think I'm focused on the gross.
Okay. As long as somebody's got it, we're good. Yes.
It says that people eat cordyceps, but they don't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
People choose to eat cordyceps?
like
Yeah.
Olympians.
Yeah.
It's supposedly medicinal, which is really interesting. I don't know the details of that. Cordyceps fungus, yeah. So the thing I mentioned right at the beginning, which is in Planet Earth and stuff like that, which is why I didn't go into it too much in depth. But it's a whole genus of fungus, fungi that they each target a particular organism. They operate on insects for the most part, but each one is specific to a particular ants or grasshoppers or whatever. And apparently it's medicinal. I don't know the details of that, but yeah.
I don't think there's real trial studies.
Mushrooms.
Tiny follow-up. Some of this.
Final.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've already asked him. Go ahead.
One quick comment and then a question.
Yes.
I have a friend who has toxo, very, very rare, but it was eating her cornea.
Oh wow.
But they were able to get it under control, and now it's dormant. But it could do that again at any
Eating
time.
the cornea, I hadn't
Yeah.
thought about that.
I think that's very rare.
Yeah.
And then you had mentioned I think cicada that has a fungus that
Yeah.
infects it, and it makes it go crazy and want to have sex all the time.
Psilocybin and amphetamine, yeah.
And I read about that recently, and that the researcher discovered, oh my god, psilocybin is
Yeah.
the like magic mushrooms is the mechanism, and then he actually went to the FDA
Yeah,
or to say, is it okay that I'm doing research
Yeah,
for
the
this
DEA
illegal
or something
drug?
like that. Yeah, right.
Do you know any more about that? Can you share any more about that? Or
I think I might have read this a similar article basically saying that, yeah, he had a Schedule 1 controlled substance in this cicada that he's studying in his lab. He just suddenly discovered, and he's like, oh God, am I going to get arrested?
do I need some kind of special permission?
But I think I can say what's really fascinating about that to me is it's the only other organism we know that creates psilocybin, like the magic mushroom, right? We're all familiar with, it has a psychedelic substance in it, psilocybin. But it's the only other thing, and it's this completely different fungus on a completely different branch of that tree. It's supposedly diverged evolutionarily like 800 million years ago, and so it's supposedly a parallel evolution, not diverged from the same root. They think, which is really remarkable that it would develop this very specific compound through parallel evolution.
And it seems like the cicada's on just some kind of crazy trip too.
Right, I know, right? Well, with a third of its body missing and whatever else, I mean, hopefully it's having a good time anyway.
I'm thinking horizontal gene transfer.
Maybe, yeah, that's possible. And they're both fungi, so it's possible that could, of course, can happen.
It's like a retrovirus. Retrovirus can pick up a gene and then infect it.
Okay, what was that?
All right, that is it. If you guys have more questions,
Amazing.
please.